She woke in a Dublin hospital without recognizing her own reflection. The face was the same, but something was wrong. A scar that had never existed, a handkerchief embroidered with unfamiliar initials, and a name whispered by nurses who pretended not to hear. With each glance in the mirror, memories that didn't belong to her returned like echoes. A child's cry, the smell of smoke, a name struck from an old register. And the more she tried to understand, the more she realized the entire hospital seemed to be hiding something. Something connected to that blue handkerchief, to her past, and perhaps to what she believed was the end. But that morning, when an elderly worker approached her bed and said, "You shouldn't have survived that," Nora realized it wasn't just her memory that had been erased. It was her entire history. And now the mirror was the only witness to what really happened, and what was still to come. The moment the reflection shattered, she saw a face behind her own, that of a child calling out to her, by the name no one in the hospital dared pronounce. Nora Keene awoke to the insistent sound of cardiac monitors. The smell of disinfectant and the metallic echo of nurses' footsteps revealed the same hospital, where she'd already lost 2 friends. But now it was she who lay in the bed, half her body immobile and her mind scrambled. She asked for a mirror, not out of vanity but from fear of forgetting her own face. When the glass was placed before her, Nora felt the air disappear. The thin scar beside her left temple didn't belong to her. It had never existed there. And the reflection returned something more. A name embroidered on a handkerchief resting on the bedside cabinet. L. Byrne. She didn't know who it was, but she knew the name was staring back at her. In the second moment, the nurse, Sinead O'Driscoll, approached carefully like someone handling cracked porcelain. She tried to remove the mirror, saying that reflections deceive fragile minds. But Nora held the glass firmly, defying her own partial paralysis. "This handkerchief isn't mine," she whispered. "And this name, L. Byrne, he died here, didn't he?" Sinead paled, exchanged a glance with another nurse and said, "There's no record of that name on this ward." Nora then realized that the silence was more revealing than any answer. In the third moment, the elderly woman closed her eyes and saw disconnected flashes: a flooded corridor, a crying child, a man's voice shouting for help. When she opened her eyes, she was alone. The mirror had fallen to the floor and cracked right down the center, as if dividing her face in two, what she remembered and what she couldn't remember. Outside, the bell of St. Audouin's church marked midday, and Nora could have sworn she heard someone whisper her name. The first cold she felt wasn't from her body, it was from her soul. The rain began falling softly against the window panes, that fine Dublin drizzle that seems to seep into one's very bones. Nora's room was on the third floor of St. James's Hospital, overlooking the gray rooftops of the city she'd called home for 74 years. She'd been a seamstress once, her fingers nimble with needle and thread, mending the torn hems of other people's lives, whilst her own slowly unraveled. Widowed at 52, childless, or so she'd been told, she'd lived a quiet existence in a small flat in the Liberties, where the streets still remembered the old days and neighbors still knew one another's names. The stroke had come without warning 3 days prior, collapsing her world into darkness as she'd walked home from morning mass. She'd woken here, in this sterile room that smelled of bleach and something older, something that reminded her of burnt fabric. Her left side refused to obey her commands, her leg dragging uselessly, her arm hanging like dead weight. But her mind, fractured though it might be, was beginning to piece together fragments that didn't fit. That scar, that bloody scar. Nora touched her temple again, feeling the ridge of tissue that shouldn't exist. She'd never had surgery there, never fallen, never been struck. Yet there it was, pale and thin, like a whisper carved into her skin. And the handkerchief, the blue handkerchief with those careful initials, lay beside her like an accusation. She reached for it with her good hand, the fabric worn soft with age, and brought it to her face. It smelled of lavender and something medicinal, something that made her stomach turn. L. Byrne, she murmured again, testing the name on her tongue like a prayer she'd forgotten. The afternoon stretched on in painful slowness. Nurses came and went, their smiles too bright, their words too careful. They checked her blood pressure, adjusted her drip, asked how she was feeling in voices that suggested they already knew the answer and didn't particularly want to hear it. Nora watched them through half-closed eyes, noting the way they avoided looking at the handkerchief, the way their gazes skittered away from the bedside cabinet, as though something there might bite. When evening fell and the ward grew quiet, Nora reached for the broken mirror she'd hidden beneath her pillow. The glass was cold against her palm, sharp edges catching the dim light. She angled it towards the door, watching the corridor beyond through its fractured surface. And there, standing just outside her room, was a figure in a dark overcoat, holding an old leather case. The person wasn't moving, just watching. Waiting. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, swallowed by the hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of television sets from other rooms. When she blinked, the figure vanished. Only the sound of the handkerchief falling to the floor remained, and in the broken mirror's reflection the embroidered letters seemed to have changed. Now they read N. Keen. Her hands began to shake, the mirror slipping from her grasp. This wasn't a stroke. This wasn't confusion or medication or a fragile mind playing tricks. This was something else entirely. Something that had been buried and was now clawing its way back to the surface, dragging her down with it. The night pressed against the windows, and Nora Keen, 74 years old, half paralyzed, alone in a hospital bed, finally understood that she wasn't recovering from death. She was remembering it. The nurse returns with a medical file in her hand, and the name L. Burn appears scribbled, struck through in red ink on a page dated 1979. The following day dawned with fine rain over Dublin. Nora woke determined. She asked the nurse to bring her the handkerchief. Sinead hesitated, but yielded. The initials LB were embroidered with blue thread, worn and ancient. In the corner, a spot of dried blood. Nora touched the cloth with trembling fingers and a memory pulsed. A child in school uniform with the same handkerchief tied to their wrist, being carried away in the arms of a doctor in a white coat. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came, but it left behind a certainty. That handkerchief was proof of something the hospital was trying to erase. The rain continued throughout the morning, that persistent Irish rain that seems to have no beginning and no end, just an eternal gray presence that settles over everything like a shroud. Nora lay in her hospital bed, the blue handkerchief clutched in her good hand, staring at those faded initials as though they might speak if she looked hard enough. The blood spot in the corner had turned rust brown with age, a tiny galaxy of violence preserved in fabric. She pressed her thumb against it and felt something shift in her chest. Not pain, but recognition. The kind that comes not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, from the marrow of one's bones. During the shift change, the junior doctor Adine Fury entered to check her vital signs. She was young, perhaps in her early 30s, with copper-red hair pulled back in a severe bun and freckles scattered across her pale skin like fallen leaves. There was something careful about the way she moved, as though she were walking through a room full of sleeping dogs she dared not wake. Nora insisted. She wanted to see the records from the year when the name L. Byrne had been struck through. Adine tried to disguise her reaction, saying that the old archives were being restored. But the hesitation in her voice betrayed something. Nora noticed that the doctor knew more than she was saying, and something about that surname seemed to disturb her deeply. "Please," Nora said, her voice stronger than it had been since the stroke. "I'm not confused. I'm not senile. Whatever happened in 1979, it happened to me." Adine's hand stilled on the blood pressure cuff. For a moment she looked as though she might speak, might crack open and spill all the secrets she carried. But then the professional mask slid back into place, smooth and impenetrable. "Mrs. Keene, you've suffered a significant stroke. It's normal for memories to become confused, conflated. The brain tries to make sense of gaps by creating narratives that feel real, but this handkerchief is real," Nora interrupted, holding it up. "These initials are real. That name in the file you're pretending doesn't exist is real." And somewhere in this hospital, someone knows why I have a scar I never had before and memories of a child I was told never existed. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Adine's face had gone pale beneath those freckles, and her eyes, green-gray like the Irish Sea on a winter morning, were bright with something that might have been fear or might have been grief. She opened her mouth to respond, but the door swung open and another nurse called her away to an emergency. As she left, her identification badge slipped from her coat pocket and fell to the floor. Nora waited until the footsteps had faded before reaching down with her good arm, her fingers stretching painfully towards the small plastic card. She managed to hook it with her fingertips and drag it close enough to read. The photograph showed a younger version of Adine, smiling uncertainly at the camera. but it was the text that made Nora's heart stop. Hospital St. James's, Pediatric Ward, Supervisor, Dr. Liam Byrne. The badge was old, dated 1978, laminated but yellowing at the edges. And there, in the corner, someone had written in faded biro, "In memory." Nora's mind began to race, pieces clicking together like the tumblers of a lock. L. Byrne, Liam Byrne, the pediatric ward, a child with a handkerchief tied to their wrist, the blood, the scar. The memories that felt like someone else's but tasted like her own tears. She'd been pregnant once. She remembered that much. 43 years ago when she was 31 and newly married to Thomas Keene, a bus driver with kind eyes and rough hands. They'd been so happy, so hopeful. She'd sewn tiny clothes in the evenings whilst he read the newspaper and talked about names. But then what? The memories grew murky, like trying to see through dirty water. She remembered going into labor early, remembered the hospital, this hospital, St. James's, remembered pain and fear and someone telling her to push, to breathe, to hold on. And then, nothing. A blank space where something vital should have been. When she'd woken days later, they'd told her the baby had been stillborn. A boy, they'd said. Too small to survive. Better this way, they'd said. Better not to see him. Better to move on. And she'd believe them because what choice did she have? She'd buried the grief deep and learned to live around it, the way one learns to live around a missing limb. But if that handkerchief existed, if that name existed, if those memories were real. Night fell with a swiftness that seemed unnatural. Nora waited until the ward settled into its evening routine, the medication rounds, the dinner trays, the visiting hours that no one visited her during. She positioned the broken mirror so she could see the door, watching through its fractured surface as shadows moved in the corridor beyond. And there, once again, was the figure in the dark overcoat, standing perfectly still outside her room. This time, Nora didn't blink. She stared directly at the reflection, willing it to stay, to solidify, to become something she could confront. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . The figure seemed to sense her gaze and turned slightly, and in the dim light Nora caught a glimpse of the face beneath the overcoat's collar. It was a man, elderly, with hollow cheeks and eyes that held a terrible knowing. He raised one hand slowly and Nora saw he was holding something, a photograph old and curling at the edges. She tried to sit up to call out, but her body betrayed her. By the time she'd managed to prop herself on one elbow, the figure had vanished. but on the floor just inside her doorway lay a photograph. Nora used her walking frame to drag herself across the room, each movement an agony of determination. She reached the photograph and picked it up with shaking hands. The image was faded, the colors washed out to sepia tones but unmistakable. It showed a younger version of herself, 31, pregnant, smiling uncertainly at the camera. And beside her, his arm around her shoulders, was a man in a doctor's coat. Dark-haired, serious-faced, with a name badge that read Dr. L. Byrne. On the back, in careful handwriting, were the words, Nora and Liam, St. James's, March 1979, before everything changed. The photograph slipped from her fingers. The room spun, and in the broken mirror's reflection, Nora saw the child again. The boy with dark hair and her own gray-green eyes holding out that blue handkerchief as though it were the only truth left in the world. When morning came, Nora's medical file had vanished from its usual place at the nurse's station, and the ward sister, a stern woman named Margaret whom Nora had never seen before, informed her that she was being transferred to a different room for her own safety and recovery. Room 12B. The number meant nothing to Nora. But the way the nurses avoided looking at her when they said it, the way their voices dropped to whispers, the way even the orderly who wheeled her bed seemed nervous, all of it told her that room 12B was somewhere no one wanted to go. The new room was smaller and colder. The sign on the door read, 12B. Nora felt a shiver run through her, the same number that had appeared in the corner of the struck-through file. On the opposite wall, an oval mirror reflected the iron bed. Sinead tried to cover it with a towel, but Nora asked her to leave it. Let me see what this room remembers. In the reflection, something gleamed. It was a stain on the floor, precisely where the evening sun struck. An old stain, yellowed, that even cleaning couldn't completely erase. They wheeled her bed through corridors that seemed to grow narrower with each turn, past wards where patients watched with hollow eyes, past notice boards displaying faded health warnings from decades past. The deeper they went into the hospital, the older everything became. The paint more chipped, the floors more worn, the smell more pungent with age and disinfectant and something else. Something that reminded Nora of bonfire night, of things burning that should never burn. Room 12B sat at the end of a corridor that felt forgotten by time. The door was heavy, painted institutional green, with a small window of reinforced glass that had turned yellow with age. The orderly who pushed her bed seemed eager to leave, depositing her inside with perfunctory efficiency and vanishing before she could ask questions. Sinead followed more slowly, her face troubled, her usual professional composure cracking at the edges. "This room hasn't been used in years," Nora said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. The air tasted stale, like a mouth that had been closed too long. "Why am I here?" Sinead busied herself with arranging the bed, checking the oxygen connection, avoiding Nora's gaze. "The other room needed deep cleaning. This is temporary." But her hands shook as she spoke, and when she finally looked at Nora, her eyes were bright with something that looked dangerously close to fear. The mirror on the wall was old, its silver backing tarnished and spotted, giving every reflection a ghostly quality. Nora studied herself in it, an old woman, gray-haired and half-broken, clutching a blue handkerchief like a talisman. But beyond her reflection, she could see the room itself. Plain walls, a single window looking out onto a gray courtyard, and that stain on the floor. The longer she looked at it, the more certain she became that it wasn't just age or water damage. It was the wrong color for that. Too organic. Too deliberate. A new visitor arrived in the afternoon. An elderly man in a maintenance worker's gray coveralls, a worn green waistcoat buttoned over them, and boots that had seen decades of service. His hair was iron gray and disheveled, his face deeply lined, his blue eyes faded like old denim. He carried a toolbox and moved with the careful slowness of someone who'd learned not to rush, not to draw attention. Declan O'Hanrahan, he introduced himself, his voice rough as gravel. "Been working here 40 years come November." He set down his toolbox and looked at Nora with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're in room 12. 12B, Nora corrected. "There is no B," Declan said quietly. "They added that later, to pretend it was different, but it's still room 12. He moved to the window, ostensibly to check the frame, but Nora could see he was gathering courage. Are you related to Liam Byrne?" The name hung in the air like a physical presence. Nora's heart began to race, that irregular flutter that the monitors would surely catch and summon nurses running. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know who Liam Byrne was. But I think I need to." Declan turned back to her, and his face had gone pale. "Then you shouldn't be in this room. This room should have been sealed, should have been locked and forgotten." He glanced at the door as though expecting someone to burst through. "Since the fire." Fire. The word escaped Nora's lips as barely a whisper. 1979, Declan said. And now he was speaking quickly, urgently, as though the words had been dammed up for too long and were finally breaking free. There was an accident. A fire in the pediatric ward started just after midnight. They evacuated most of the children, but... He paused, swallowing hard. One child died. Or so they said. And a doctor, Dr. Liam Byrne. He went back in to try to save the boy. Neither of them came out. But they never found the bodies, not really, just traces. And then the hospital sealed the records, said it was better that way, better to move on. Nora's hands had gone numb. The handkerchief fell from her grasp onto the bed. A child died, she repeated. What was the child's name? But Declan was already backing towards the door, his courage spent, his face ashen. The name was struck from the records, erased, as though the boy had never existed at all, as though his mother had never... He stopped, shook his head. I've said too much, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. He left before Nora could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded to nothing. The room grew dark as evening fell. Nora sat propped up in the iron bed, staring at that stain on the floor, watching as the fading sunlight caught it and made it glow faintly amber. And for just a moment, just a heartbeat, she smelled it. Smoke. Not cigarette smoke or cooking smoke, but the acrid, choking smell of things burning that should never burn. Wood and fabric and something else. Something that made her stomach turn and her eyes water. She reached for the broken mirror she'd smuggled with her, hidden in the folds of her cardigan, angled it towards the stain, and there, in the fractured reflection, she saw movement. A shadow that shouldn't be there, small and child-sized, crouching beside the stain as though waiting. As though it had been waiting for 43 years. Nora's breath caught. She tried to speak, to call out, but her voice had abandoned her. The shadow turned, and she glimpsed a face. Young, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair and eyes that held an impossible knowing. The boy was wearing a school uniform, gray shorts and a jumper, and around his wrist was tied a blue handkerchief with careful embroidered initials. Luke, Nora whispered, and the name came from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere that had been locked away and was now breaking open. Luke. The shadow reached out one small hand towards her, and Nora saw he was holding something. A photograph. The same photograph she'd found outside her door showing her younger self with Dr. Byrne. But in this version, in the Reflections version, there was a third figure. A small boy between them, smiling at the camera with gap-toothed innocence. Nora jerked her head up, looking away from the mirror to the actual room. It was empty. Just her in the iron bed and that stain on the floor. But when she looked back at the mirror, the boy was still there in the reflection, still holding out the photograph like an offering or an accusation. She turned her head sharply, her heart hammering, looking directly at the spot where the reflection showed the child. Nothing. Just empty floor and that amber stain. But when she looked back at the broken mirror one final time, she saw that the boy had moved. He was standing now, pointing at something behind her, his mouth forming words she couldn't hear. Nora turned as quickly as her damaged body would allow. On the bedside cabinet, something had appeared that hadn't been there moments before. A photograph, old and faded and curling at the edges. And in it, clearly visible despite the age, was Nora, younger, perhaps 31, holding a small child in her arms. A boy with dark hair and her own gray-green eyes. On the back, in her own handwriting from decades past, were the words, "My Luke, 6 months old, February 1979. The monitors began to shriek. Nurses came running. But Nora barely heard them, barely felt their hands on her, checking her pulse, adjusting her drip, asking questions she couldn't answer. She was staring at the photograph, at the child she'd been told had died, at the proof that her entire life had been built on a lie. Cliffhanger. In the mirror's reflection, the boy dropped a photograph, and in it, Nora appears younger, holding that same child in her arms. Night fell like a veil over the hospital. Nora held the photograph in her hands, the paper trembling between her fingers. The boy's face was familiar, deep brown eyes, a shy smile. On the back, written in pencil, "For Mammy, with love, Luke." Nora felt the ground disappear beneath her. The name, Luke Byrne. The initials on the handkerchief. The name struck from the file. The boy was her son. The son they'd told her had died at birth. The photograph was proof. Physical, undeniable proof. Nora traced the child's face with one trembling finger, remembering now with a clarity that felt like glass cutting through fog. She'd held him. Only once. But she'd held him. For perhaps 30 seconds before they'd taken him away, before the nurse had administered an injection that made the world go soft and gray. She'd heard him cry, a strong, healthy cry, and then nothing. When she'd woken days later, they'd told her the baby had been stillborn, that she'd been confused by the trauma of labor, that what she remembered was impossible. But here was Luke, 6 months old in this photograph, alive, real. smiling at the camera with her eyes in someone else's darker coloring. How could a dead child grow to 6 months? How could a stillborn infant smile? The despair gave way to a cold, crystalline fury. Nora pressed the call button, not gently but with violence, holding it down until footsteps came running. She demanded to see Dr. Adine Fury. Not tomorrow, not when convenient, but now, immediately. This instant. The night nurse, a woman Nora didn't recognize, tried to calm her. It's past 11, Mrs. Keene. The doctor has finished her shift. Perhaps in the morning. Fetch her, Nora said, and her voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before. Something that brooked no argument, no deflection. Fetch her now, or I will scream this hospital down around your ears. I will wake every patient on every floor. I will make such a scene that the newspapers will hear of it by morning. Fetch her now. The nurse left hurriedly. "20 minutes later, Adine appeared in the doorway, still wearing her coat, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale with exhaustion, and something else. Something that looked like dread. Nora held up the photograph. "Explain this." Adine's eyes widened. She stepped into the room and closed the door carefully behind her, then leaned against it as though needing the support. "Where did you get that?" "Does it matter? My son, Luke, 6 months old, the son you all told me was dead." Nora's voice cracked on the last word. "How? How is this possible?" Adine moved closer, her movements slow and careful. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, and tears began to slide down her cheeks, silent and unchecked. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear to you, I didn't know until I saw the badge, until I started asking questions." She sank into the chair beside Nora's bed. "My father, Dr. Liam Byrne, he died before I was born." "My mother told me he was a good man who'd made an impossible choice. I never understood what she meant until—" She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small key, tarnished brass with the number 12 engraved into its head. This was in his belongings. My mother kept them in a box she never opened. When I finally did, after she died last year, I found this key and a note. It said, "Room 12. The truth you can't unknow." Adine looked up at Nora, her green-gray eyes swimming. "I've been working at St. James's for 3 years. I've never used this key. I've been too afraid." "Use it now," Nora said. Adine hesitated, then nodded. She stood and moved to the bedside cabinet, the one Nora had assumed was just hospital furniture. But when Adine inserted the key into a lock Nora hadn't noticed, cleverly hidden in the decorative molding, a small drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside was an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax that had cracked and crumbled. Across the front, in careful handwriting, confidential file, case LB79. Aideen lifted it out with shaking hands and brought it to Nora. Together, they broke the seal. A single sheet of paper slid free. It was a death certificate, but not like any Nora had seen before. The fields were filled in: name, date, cause of death. But there was no signature, no official stamp. And in the space marked mother, someone had taken a thick black pen and scribbled through the name until it was completely illegible. But they'd missed a corner, just visible beneath the ink. Nora Kia. They forged it, Nora said, her voice hollow. They forged my son's death certificate. Aideen was reading the cause of death line, her face growing paler with each word. Smoke inhalation, injuries sustained in fire. But Luke. She looked up at Nora. If he died in the fire at 6 months old, not at birth, then for 6 months he was alive. Where was he? Who was caring for him? Why did they tell you? A sound in the corridor made them both freeze. Footsteps, measured and deliberate, coming closer. Aideen moved quickly, shoving the envelope and key into Nora's hands. Hide these. Under your mattress anywhere. If anyone asks, you've never seen them. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A shadow fell across the reinforced glass. And then a voice, male and authoritative. Dr. Fury, we need to speak with you. Immediately. Aideen met Nora's eyes for a brief moment, a look passing between them that held all the weight of shared conspiracy, shared grief, shared determination. Then she straightened her shoulders, fixed her face into a professional mask, and opened the door. 2 men stood in the corridor. One was clearly hospital administration, suit, tie, clipboard, the bearing of someone who'd spent years pushing papers and enforcing rules. The other was older, perhaps 70, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He wore a doctor's white coat, pristine and perfectly pressed, with a name badge that read, Dr. Edmund Fitzpatrick, Chief Medical Director. Dr. Fury, Fitzpatrick said, his voice smooth as oil. We understand you've been accessing archived files without authorization, files that were sealed for very specific reasons. His gaze moved past Aideen to Nora, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, fear, and questioning patience about matters that are best left undisturbed. I'm treating a patient, Aideen said, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face. Mrs. Keene has been experiencing significant psychological distress related to historical trauma. I'm simply trying to provide appropriate care. By dredging up records from 1979, by discussing fires and deaths in sealed cases, the administrator consulted his clipboard. You're relieved of this patient's care, effective immediately. Dr. Walsh will take over in the morning. On what grounds? Conflict of interest, Fitzpatrick said softly. Your father was involved in the incident Mrs. Keene is confused about. We feel it's inappropriate for you to continue treatment. He smiled, but it was the smile of a shark. I'm sure you understand. Aideen opened her mouth to protest, but Fitzpatrick had already turned away, dismissing her. He stepped into Nora's room, and the administrator followed, closing the door firmly behind them with a click that sounded terribly final. Mrs. Keene, Fitzpatrick said, moving to stand beside her bed. Up close, she could see the coldness in his eyes, the calculation. I understand you've been having some distressing delusions related to your stroke. It's not uncommon. The brain, when damaged, tries to fill in gaps with false memories, confabulations that feel real but aren't. He spoke slowly, as though to a child. The hospital has your best interests at heart. We always have. Where is my son? Nora asked, her voice cutting through his patronizing tone like a knife. Fitzpatrick's smile never wavered. Your medical records indicate you've never had children, Mrs. Keene. Perhaps you're confused. I have a photograph. I have a death certificate. I have a handkerchief with his initials. I have memories that your drugs and your lies couldn't quite erase. Nora sat up straighter, ignoring the screaming protest of her damaged body. I want to know where Luke is. I want to know what happened in that fire. And I want to know why you're so desperate to keep me from finding out. The administrator shifted uncomfortably, but Fitzpatrick remained perfectly still. Finally he spoke, and his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. Some questions, Mrs. Keene, are dangerous to ask, for everyone involved. I would strongly advise you to focus on your recovery and let the past remain where it belongs. Buried. He left without another word, the administrator scurrying after him like a nervous dog. The door closed, and the lock turned with a soft but unmistakable click. Nora was alone in room 12, locked in with her photograph and her forged death certificate and the ghost of her son in the mirror. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear footsteps approaching again. But these were different, slower, heavier, and accompanied by a voice she'd heard once before 43 years ago, shouting for help in a burning hospital. You should never have seen this. The door opened slowly, and the figure that emerged wasn't a nurse, nor a doctor. It was Declan O'Hanrahan, the old maintenance worker who'd warned Nora about the fire. He carried in his hands a yellowed folder, bound with a worn elastic band. "I should have burnt this years ago, but I couldn't find the courage," he murmured. Inside were newspaper clippings from the Evening Herald dated 1979. One headline read, "Fire in Pediatric Ward. Child and Doctor Vanish." The doctor's name? Dr. Liam Byrne. Nora felt her chest tighten. This was the same name from the handkerchief, the same surname from the photograph. Everything was beginning to fit together. Declan moved into the room like a man approaching his own execution, each step weighted with years of guilt. The folder in his hands was swollen with age, the elastic band so perished it snapped when he tried to remove it, scattering papers across Nora's bed like autumn leaves. She gathered them with shaking hands. Newspaper clippings, yes, but also something more. Handwritten notes, incident reports, photographs that had never made it into any official file. "I was there that night," Declan said, sitting heavily in the chair beside her bed. His hands trembled as he picked up one of the clippings, the paper so fragile it seemed it might crumble at his touch. "June 17th, 1979. I was working the night shift, doing my rounds. It was just gone midnight when the alarm went off in the pediatric ward." He closed his eyes and Nora could see he was back there, 43 years falling away like water. The smoke was thick, black, choking. "We got most of the children out quickly. There were only 6 on the ward that night. But Dr. Byrne, he ran back in, said there was one more. A baby. Luke Keene." The name fell between them like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward. "I tried to follow him," Declan continued, his voice cracking. "But the ceiling came down, blocked the corridor. We waited outside. The fire brigade came, put out the flames. When we finally got back in..." He opened his eyes, and they were bright with unshed tears. "The room where the baby had been, room 12, was destroyed, burnt to nothing. But we found no bodies. Not Dr. Byrne's, not the child's, just..." Ash and metal and that stain on the floor that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard we scrubbed. Nora picked up one of the photographs. It showed the aftermath of the fire. A charred room, blackened walls, a twisted metal cot frame. And there, on the floor, that same yellowed stain she'd been staring at for 2 days. "They never found them," she said. Not a question. "The hospital said they did. Said the bodies were too badly burnt to identify, that it was kinder to everyone to just..." Let it be. The coroner signed off. The case was closed. Dr. Burns' wife was pregnant at the time. They told her he died a hero. They told you? Declan looked at her, and his face was gray with shame. They told you your baby was stillborn. And they ordered all of us, every nurse, every doctor, every cleaner and porter, to stay silent. Said it was for the best. Said it would prevent lawsuits, prevent trauma, prevent questions that had no good answers. But you kept this, Nora said, gesturing to the folder. Why? Because silence is its own kind of burning, Declan said quietly. It eats you from the inside. Every day for 43 years, I've walked past room 12, and every day I've remembered that baby's cry cutting off and Dr. Burns shouting that he had him, that everything would be all right. And then, nothing. Just silence and smoke and lies. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and metallic. Dr. Byrne gave me this before he went back in. Made me promise to give it to the boy's mother if anything happened. But when the orders came down to seal the case, I hid it instead. Couldn't destroy it, couldn't deliver it. So I've carried it like a stone around my neck ever since. He placed the object in Nora's palm. It was a St. Christopher medal, the kind mothers pin to their children's clothing for protection during travels. But this one was partially melted, the silver warped by heat, the saint's face barely visible beneath the damage. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, Luke, always traveling home. Nora pressed the metal to her chest and felt something break open inside her, some dam that had held for 4 decades finally giving way. She wept, not quietly, but with great, tearing sobs that shook her damaged body and set the monitors shrieking. Declan stood awkwardly, uncertain whether to comfort her or flee, and in that moment of indecision the door burst open. But it wasn't nurses who entered. It was Aideen, still in her coat, her hair wild, her face flushed with exertion. I heard them talking, she gasped. Fitzpatrick and the administrators. They're planning to have you sectioned, Mrs. Keene. Declared mentally unfit. They'll move you to psychiatric care where you can be medicated and kept quiet. She looked at Declan, recognition flickering across her face. You're the one who was there, the night my father died. Declan nodded slowly. Aideen Byrne, you have your father's eyes. Tell me, Aideen said, moving to stand beside Nora's bed. Tell me the truth. Did my father really die in that fire? Declan's face twisted with an emotion Nora couldn't name. I don't know. I've spent 43 years not knowing. The official story is that he did. But he gestured to the folder. There are things that don't add up. The way the fire started, it wasn't electrical, wasn't accidental. Someone said it. And the way Dr. Byrne acted that night, like he'd been expecting something, like he had a plan. And most of all, he pulled out one final piece of paper, this one a hospital requisition form dated June 16, 1979, the day before the fire. This, a request for a transfer. Dr. Byrne had applied to move baby Luke Keene to a different facility, somewhere outside Dublin. The request was denied by the chief of staff at the time, a Dr. Edmund Fitzpatrick. The name hung in the air like poison gas. Aideen's face went white. Fitzpatrick was working here in 1979. He's been here all this time. He was junior staff then, Declan said. But he was the one who denied the transfer, and he was the one who ordered the case sealed after the fire, and now he's the one trying to silence Mrs. Keene. He looked between the two women. Whatever happened that night, Fitzpatrick knows, and he's spent 43 years making sure no one else finds out. Nora touched the metal again, feeling its weight, its wrongness. And then she looked up at the mirror on the wall, that tarnished, spotted oval that showed everything twice, once in reality and once in reflection. And there, in the glass, she saw him, not the child this time, but the man. Dr. Liam Byrne, standing behind Aideen with his hand raised as though in blessing or farewell. His face was kind despite its seriousness, his eyes the same green-gray as his daughter's. He was wearing the white coat from the photograph, and around his wrist was tied a blue handkerchief. Nora blinked and he was gone. But on Aideen's shoulder, where his hand had been, was a smudge of ash. "Your father saved him," Nora said suddenly, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious thought. He saved Luke, got him out of the fire. That's why there were no bodies, because they didn't die. She looked at Declan. "You said Dr. Byrne shouted that he had him, that everything would be all right. What if it was? What if he got Luke out and then what? Where would he have taken a baby he'd just rescued from a fire set by someone who wanted the child dead?" The three of them stared at each other, the pieces clicking together like bones knitting back into wholeness. "The basement," Declan whispered. "There's a tunnel system under the old hospital, built during the War of Independence for moving supplies, smuggling people out. Most of it's been sealed off for decades, but..." His eyes widened. "Room 12 is directly above one of the old access points. If Dr. Byrne knew about the tunnels, if he had a way down..." "He could have hidden Luke there," Aideen finished. "Waited for the fire to die down, and then..." And then smuggled him out of the hospital entirely, Nora said. Made everyone believe both of them had died. But where would he have taken a baby? He couldn't just walk out with someone else's child. Aideen's hands flew to her mouth. Oh God, an adoption. A private adoption. Back then, before all the regulations, before the tribunals and investigations, it wouldn't have been hard, especially with the help of someone with medical authority who could forge documents, create a new identity. Your father gave my son a new life, Nora said, understanding blooming like a dark flower. Saved him from whoever set that fire. But why? Why would someone want a 6-month-old baby dead? None of them had an answer. But in the mirror's reflection, the ash on Aideen's shoulder had spread, forming letters spelling out a single word in gray and black. Legacy. Cliffhanger. Nora realizes the doctor who's been treating her is the daughter of the man who saved her baby, and perhaps the only one who knows the complete truth. The following morning, Aideen entered the room with a haggard look. Her white coat was creased, the shadows beneath her eyes deep. She sat beside Nora and said, I need to tell you something before someone stops me. Her voice trembled. She told how she'd grown up hearing her mother speak of a man called Liam, a doctor who'd vanished in a fire at St. James's, a man who'd saved a child, but had been unjustly accused of negligence and hidden away by his superiors. My full name is Aideen Byrne, and that man was my father. The words settled over the room like snow, soft and suffocating. Nora found she couldn't speak, couldn't move. She didn't know whether to weep or scream or reach out and embrace this young woman who carried her father's guilt like a birthright. Aideen sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension, her breathing shallow. I never knew him, Aideen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He died 2 months before I was born. My mother, Mired was her name, she told me he was a hero, that he'd saved a child from a fire and lost his own life in the process. She showed me newspaper clippings, a medal of commendation the hospital sent. She kept his white coat hanging in her wardrobe, still smelling of antiseptic and smoke. And every year on the anniversary of his death, she'd light a candle and say a prayer for the baby he'd saved. But she never told you the baby's name, Nora said. Aideen shook her head. She said she didn't know it, that the hospital had kept it confidential, that it was better not to know. But sometimes, late at night when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her crying and saying, "Liam, what did you do? What terrible choice did you make?" She looked up at Nora, and her eyes were red-rimmed and swimming. I went into medicine because of him, wanted to be like the hero my mother described. But when I started working here at St. James's, when I began to hear the whispers, the gaps in the official story, the way certain senior staff would change the subject whenever his name came up, I knew there was more. Something dark. Something they were desperate to keep buried. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small cassette tape, the kind that hadn't been common in decades. The plastic case was cracked, the label faded but still legible. L. Byrne, Personal, June 1979. "I found this in my mother's belongings after she died last year," Aideen said, "along with his diary and that key. I couldn't bring myself to listen to it at first, too afraid of what it might contain. But then you arrived, with your questions and your handkerchief and your memories that everyone said were impossible. And I knew it was connected." She produced a small, battery-powered cassette player from her bag, the kind school children had used decades ago for language lessons. "This is the recording I found with the diary. It's from the night of the fire." Nora's hand shook as Aideen placed the player in them, pressed play, and stepped back. For a moment, there was only the hiss of old magnetic tape, the crackle of decades-old technology. Then a voice emerged, male and urgent, speaking quickly as though time were running out. "My name is Liam Byrne. It's June 17th, 1979, just after 11 in the evening. If anyone hears this, if this tape survives what's about to happen, then you need to know the truth. The baby, Luke Keene, he's in danger. Someone in this hospital wants him dead, and I don't have proof. Can't go to the guards. Can't trust anyone in authority because I think it goes high up. Very high up. I've tried to get him transferred to another facility, somewhere safe, but the request was denied. Tonight, I received a warning. Not explicit, but clear enough. An anonymous note pushed under my office door. Some mistakes are better left unmade. I know what it means. They're coming for him tonight. There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling, a door closing. Then Liam's voice again, quieter now, more controlled. "I've made arrangements. If something happens, if there's a fire or an accident or anything that forces evacuation, I know where to take him. There's a tunnel beneath room 12, part of the old network from the War of Independence." I've cleared it, stocked it with supplies, milk, nappies, blankets. I can hide him there until it's safe. And if it's never safe, then I have contacts. People who can take a baby, give him a new identity, a new life far from here, away from whatever legacy someone thinks he carries. Nora's breath caught. Legacy. The same word that had appeared in ash on Aideen's shoulder. The mother, Nora Keene. She's a good woman. This will destroy her. But better a living son she believes is dead than a dead son she watched be murdered. I've chosen her grief over his death. God forgive me, but I've chosen. If you're hearing this, Nora, know that Luke is alive, that I hid him in the basement until the fire passed, that his name is Luke Keene Byrne now and he's safe. The mother will never know. For her own safety. For his safety. For the recording cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of alarms shrieking, people shouting, and then nothing but dead air. Nora let the player fall from her hands. It hit the floor, and the battery compartment popped open, batteries rolling away across the linoleum. He's alive, she whispered. Luke is alive. Was alive, Aideen corrected gently. The recording is 43 years old. We don't know what happened after. Whether my father managed to get him out. Whether the people who set the fire found them. Whether... He's alive, Nora repeated, and this time it wasn't a whisper but a declaration. I can feel it. A mother knows. She looked up at Aideen, and something fierce blazed in her gray-green eyes. Your father saved him, got him out, and then he gave him away to protect him. But from what? From whom? What legacy could a 6-month-old baby carry that was worth murder? Aideen picked up one of the newspaper clippings Declan had left. This one was different from the others. Older, dated March 1979, just after Luke's birth. It was from the social pages, a small announcement. Congratulations to Thomas and Nora Keene on the birth of their son, Luke Thomas Keene, born March 3rd at St. James's Hospital. Beneath it, someone had written in pencil, grandson of Margaret Keene, née O'Malley. Last of the O'Malley line. O'Malley, Aideen said slowly. That name, I've seen it before, in hospital records. Not patient records, but she pulled out her mobile phone, fingers flying across the screen. The hospital's historical foundation documents. The original benefactors who funded St. James's back in the 1700s. She found what she was looking for and turned the screen to show Nora. The O'Malley family, wealthy merchants, landowners. They donated the land and the initial building funds, and in exchange, they retained certain privileges, seats on the board, authority over certain decisions. Access to records. What does that have to do with my son? I don't know, Aideen admitted. But if Luke was the last of the O'Malley line, if there was some inheritance, some claim he would have had as an adult. She trailed off, the implications too large to voice. The door opened without warning. Both women jumped, Aideen instinctively moving to shield Nora. But it wasn't Fitzpatrick or security. It was Declan, breathing hard as though he'd run the entire way. In his hands was an old leather-bound book, its cover water-stained and warped. Found this in the tunnels, he gasped. Dr. Burns' diary. He must have dropped it when whatever happened, happened. He placed it on the bed, and pages fell open to an entry dated June 16, 1979. They've denied the transfer. Fitzpatrick himself delivered the news, and there was something in his eyes. Triumph, malice, certainty. He knows about Luke's heritage. Someone must have told him, must have checked the birth records and traced the family tree. The O'Malley Trust Fund matures when the last heir reaches 18. Millions, held in trust for generations, waiting. If Luke dies before that, the money reverts to the hospital, to the board, to the people who've been looting it for decades. It's not about the baby. It's about the money. It's always about the money. Nora read the words once, twice, 3 times. And then she looked up at Aideen with tears streaming down her face. They tried to kill my son for money, tried to burn him alive so they could steal his inheritance. And your father... She reached out and took the young doctor's hand. Your father gave everything to stop them. His life, his name, his future. He saved Luke and then disappeared so they couldn't use him to find the boy. And my mother lived for 43 years believing he was a hero, Aideen said, her voice breaking. Never knowing he was also a fugitive, never knowing he might still be. The door burst open with violence. Dr. Edmund Fitzpatrick stood there, flanked by 2 security guards and a hospital administrator Nora didn't recognize. His face was cold, carved from marble, completely devoid of warmth or mercy. Dr. Byrne, he said, his voice sharp as a scalpel, you're dismissed effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Mrs. Keene, you're being transferred to psychiatric care for your own protection. These delusions have become dangerous. Not delusions, Nora interrupted. Truth. The truth you've spent 43 years and God knows how much money trying to bury. She held up the diary. It's all here. The O'Malley Trust. The murder plot. Your denial of the transfer request that would have saved a baby's life. Fitzpatrick's mask slipped for just a moment, rage flashing across his features before he controlled it. That diary is hospital property. Confidential medical records. I'll have the guards here in 5 minutes if you don't hand it over immediately. Then call them, Nora said. Please. I'd love to explain to the Gardaí why you're so desperate to suppress evidence of attempted infanticide and fraud. She smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Or perhaps you'd prefer the newspapers. I imagine the Irish Times would find this fascinating. Hospital director covers up 40-year-old murder plot to embezzle patient trust fund. I can see the headline now. The administrator stepped forward nervously. Mrs. Keene, please, we can discuss this reasonably. If there are concerns about historical irregularities, we have proper channels. Proper channels that lead directly through Dr. Fitzpatrick's office? Aideen interjected. No, thank you. Fitzpatrick looked at them both, calculation visible behind his eyes. Finally, he gestured to the security guards. Leave us. This requires a more delicate approach. When they hesitated, he snapped, Now. The door closed, leaving just the four of them. Nora, Aideen, Declan, and the man who'd tried to murder a baby for money. What do you want? Fitzpatrick asked quietly. The truth, Nora said. And my son. The door bursts open. Two administrators enter and order the doctor to hand over all confidential material from case LB79. The entire hospital seemed to breathe tension. Nora was taken to the auditorium at St. James's under the pretense of an administrative hearing. But the cold lights and the echo of footsteps betrayed a disguised trial. Aideen, pale, sat beside her. Facing them, two directors and a hospital solicitor. We're here to review unfounded allegations from a senile patient, said the man in the suit. Nora, however, didn't lower her head. She pulled the blue handkerchief from her pocket and placed it on the table. Senile or not, this handkerchief has more memory than you lot. The auditorium was rarely used anymore, a relic from the days when medical students had watched surgeries performed in the theater above, taking notes whilst men cut into living flesh below. Now it was a dusty space filled with rows of empty seats ascending into shadow, the stage lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that hummed like wasps. Nora's wheelchair had been positioned at a table facing three hospital officials who looked like judges at a tribunal. Behind them, a large mirror reflected the entire scene, doubling the crowd, multiplying the accusers. Fitzpatrick sat in the center, flanked by two board members Nora didn't recognize. A woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun, and a younger man who kept consulting his mobile phone as though this were merely an inconvenience in his busy schedule. The hospital solicitor, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stood to one side with a briefcase full of documents that Nora suspected were meant to prove her incompetent, delusional, a danger to herself and others. Mrs. Keene, Fitzpatrick began, his voice echoing in the empty space. We understand you've been making serious accusations against this hospital and its staff. Accusations of murder, fraud, conspiracy. He smiled, that terrible smile. Now, we're all sympathetic to your condition. Stroke victims often experience confusion, false memories, paranoid delusions. It's nothing to be ashamed of. With proper care and medication, I'm not confused, Nora interrupted, her voice cutting through his patronizing tone like broken glass. I'm angry. There's a difference. Aideen inserted the cassette tape into a small portable player she'd brought, the kind with external speakers. She pressed play and Liam Byrne's voice filled the auditorium. The confession, the plea for forgiveness, the account of the fire, the revelation about the O'Malley Trust Fund. The officials' faces changed as they listened, the solicitors particularly. He began scribbling notes furiously, and the younger board member actually put away his phone. When the recording ended, silence fell like a shroud. Then Fitzpatrick laughed, a short, bitter sound. A 43-year-old tape of dubious provenance recorded by a man who died in a fire he likely set himself in a moment of mental instability. This proves nothing except that Dr. Byrne was unwell and should have been relieved of duty before tragedy struck. Then explain this, Aideen said, pulling out the hospital requisition form showing Liam's denied transfer request. Explain why you personally denied a request to move a vulnerable infant to a safer facility the day before a fire conveniently broke out in his room. Coincidence. The request was denied because there were no medical grounds for transfer. The child was healthy, the mother was nearby, and moving him would have been unnecessarily disruptive. Fitzpatrick's voice was smooth, practiced. As for the fire, the investigation at the time concluded it was electrical in nature, faulty wiring, common in old buildings. Except the electrical inspection 2 weeks prior found no faults. Declan spoke up from where he stood at the back of the room. He'd refused to leave, standing like a sentinel in his maintenance coveralls. I did that inspection myself. Room 12 was completely up to code. The fire started in the middle of the floor, not near any outlets or fixtures. And there was an accelerant used. Anyone who was there could smell it. Petrol or paraffin. The female board member leaned forward, her expression troubled. Mr. Fitzpatrick, these are serious allegations. Perhaps we should remember that Mrs. Keene is a 74-year-old stroke victim with demonstrated cognitive impairment. Dr. Byrne is a junior doctor with a clear emotional conflict of interest, and Mr. O'Hanrahan is a maintenance worker with no medical or investigative training, Fitzpatrick said coldly. None of them are reliable witnesses, and even if every word of this fairy tale were true, which it isn't, it happened over 4 decades ago. Everyone involved except myself is dead. There's no case to answer. Except for the money, Nora said quietly. The O'Malley Trust Fund. The millions that were supposed to go to my son when he turned 18 but instead reverted to the hospital when he was declared dead. Where did that money go, Dr. Fitzpatrick? Because I've looked at the hospital's charitable foundation accounts online, and there's no record of any major inheritance received in 1997. The solicitor's head snapped up. What? The O'Malley Trust matured in March 1997, 18 years after my son's birth, Nora continued. If Luke had lived, he would have received approximately £3 million, worth much more today. But since he was legally dead, the trust reverted to St. James's Hospital as the secondary beneficiary. That money should be in the hospital's accounts. So where is it? Fitzpatrick's face had gone very still. That's confidential financial information that I've already given to the fraud squad, Adine lied smoothly, along with copies of everything else, the diary, the tape, the transfer request, the forged death certificate. They're very interested. The younger board member stood abruptly. Edmund, is this true? Is there money missing? Don't be absurd. This is all fantasy. Desperate accusations from... A door at the back of the auditorium opened, and everyone turned. An elderly woman entered, walking slowly with the aid of a stick. She was perhaps 80, dressed in a faded floral dress and cardigan despite the warmth, her white hair perfectly set. But it was her face that made Nora's breath catch. She had the same gray-green eyes, the same sharp cheekbones. Family eyes, O'Malley eyes. I am Margaret Walsh, née O'Malley, the woman said, her voice surprisingly strong. And I'm here to testify that everything Mrs. Keene has said is true. She made her way slowly to the front, refusing help, and faced the panel with her chin raised. I was Nora's mother-in-law. When my grandson Luke was born, I registered him with the family solicitors as the O'Malley heir. I did so quietly, without telling Nora or my son, because the family had enemies. People who'd been cheated out of land deals by my father, business rivals who'd lost fortunes to O'Malley investments. I thought I was protecting Luke by keeping it secret. She pulled out an envelope from her handbag, old and yellowed. But someone found out. Someone at this hospital who had access to birth records and did their research. 3 days after Luke's birth, I received this letter. Anonymous. It said my grandson would never live to inherit, that the O'Malley line would end, and the money would go where it belonged, to those who knew how to use it properly. The solicitor took the letter with shaking hands and read it, his face paling. He showed it to the board members, and even Fitzpatrick couldn't hide his reaction this time, a flicker of genuine fear. I kept silent after the fire. Margaret continued, tears streaming down her weathered face. Because I thought my silence would keep Nora safe. If they believed the baby was dead, truly dead, they'd have no reason to hurt her. But I've lived with the guilt for 43 years, watched my daughter-in-law grieve for a child who might have lived if I'd spoken up. Watched her husband, my son, drink himself to death with sorrow, all because I was too afraid to tell the truth. She turned to Nora, and the two women locked eyes across the space that separated them. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "I failed you, failed Luke, failed everyone." Nora wanted to rage, to scream, to demand why. Why the silence, why the secrets, why let her believe her child was dead for 4 decades? But looking at this broken old woman, this mother who'd lost her own son to grief, she found she had no anger left. Only exhaustion. Only the desperate need to know if any of it had mattered. "Is Luke alive?" Nora asked. "Do you know? Did Dr. Byrne succeed in saving him?" Margaret nodded slowly. "After the fire, I received one more letter. No return address, no signature. It said, 'The boy lives. He's safe. Never look for him.' And there was a photograph enclosed. A baby, perhaps 7 months old, healthy and smiling, with your eyes and the O'Malley cheekbones. On the back, someone had written, 'Galway.'" "Galway," Aideen breathed. "My mother's family was from Galway. She used to talk about it, about wanting to move back there after my father died. She said she had cousins there who'd offered to help." Because they did help, Margaret said. Dr. Burns' wife had family who could take in a baby, could create a new identity, could raise him as their own, and they did. I hired a private investigator once years ago to search. He found a boy adopted in Galway in late 1979. Luke Keane was his registered name, though the adoptive family called him by that name as a first name and used their surname. The investigator sent me a photograph when the boy turned 18. She pulled out another envelope, newer this time, and handed it to Nora. This is from 1997. Your son, alive and well. Nora opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a photograph of a young man, tall and strong, with dark hair and gray-green eyes that were unmistakably hers. He was standing outside a house, a carpentry workshop visible behind him, smiling at the camera with a quiet contentment that made her heart ache. "He's alive," she whispered. "My Luke is alive." In the mirror behind the panel, Nora saw the reflection change. Liam Byrne stood there once more, his hand on Aideen's shoulder, and beside him was the ghost of Thomas, her late husband, and Margaret's son. Both men were smiling, and between them, the child Luke, now grown, reaching out towards his mother across time and death and terrible secrets. The hearing dissolved into chaos after that. The solicitor demanding answers, the board members calling for investigations, Fitzpatrick attempting to leave and being blocked by Declan. But Nora heard none of it. She sat clutching the photograph, tears streaming down her face, whispering her son's name like a prayer answered after 43 years of silence. An old fax machine begins to rattle at the back of the room. Paper slides out slowly with a printed message. Adoption record, Luke Keane Byrne, 1980, current residence, Galway. Two weeks later, Nora arrived in Galway. The Atlantic wind blew strongly over Salmon Weir Bridge. Aideen accompanied her, their steps firm despite the uncertainty. They carried only the blue handkerchief and the burnt diary. At the address from the document, there was a small white-fronted house. Nora knocked on the door with her heart racing. A man in his early 40s opened it. He had brown eyes, the same shy smile from the old photograph. "Can I help you?" he asked. Nora replied, "Are you Luke Byrne?" He hesitated. "I'm Luke Keane. The orphanage gave me that name." The journey west had taken 3 hours by car, Aideen driving, whilst Nora sat in the passenger seat watching the landscape change from Dublin's grey sprawl to the wild green beauty of the west coast. They'd passed through towns whose names Nora knew only from maps: Athenry, Oranmore, Clarenbridge, until finally Galway appeared, spread along the shore like a promise. The city had changed since she'd last visited in her youth, grown larger and more modern, but the river Corrib still flowed swift and cold beneath its ancient bridges, and the smell of salt and seaweed still hung in the air. The address Margaret had provided led them to a quiet residential street in Salt Hill, where modest houses faced the gray Atlantic and children's bicycles leaned against garden walls. Number 42 was painted white with blue trim, a carpenter's workshop visible through a side gate, wood shavings scattered across the drive like confetti. The garden was well tended, roses blooming despite the late season, a child's swing hanging from an old oak tree. When Luke opened the door, Nora felt 43 years collapse into a single moment. He was tall, taller than Thomas had been, with broad shoulders from years of manual work and hands that were calloused but gentle as they held the door frame. His hair was dark brown, graying slightly at the temples, and his eyes were the same gray-green that looked back at her from mirrors, holding the same cautious intelligence, the same careful assessment of strangers. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Nora said, her voice trembling despite her determination. "My name is Nora Keene." "This is Dr. Adine Byrne. We've come from Dublin because—" She faltered, suddenly unsure how to explain the inexplicable. How do you tell a man that his entire life has been built on necessary lies? That the mother he never knew has been mourning him since before he could remember? Luke's expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the shadow of old questions finally finding form. "You'd better come in," he said quietly. The house was warm and cluttered with the comfortable chaos of a lived-in home. Photographs covered the walls, Luke as a child with an elderly couple who must have been his adoptive parents. Luke as a young man learning his trade. Luke more recently with a woman and two small children, all grinning at the camera with windswept hair. A life fully lived, complete and whole without her. They sat in the front room, tea cooling untouched on the coffee table between them, and Nora told him everything. Adine helped, filling in details about Liam Byrne and the fire and the conspiracy that had tried to murder an infant for money. Luke listened without interrupting, his face grave, his hands clasped between his knees. "I always knew I was adopted," he said when they'd finished. "Mam and Da, the Cahills, they were good people. They never hid it from me." Said my birth mother had died and my father had arranged for them to take me before. He paused. Before he died as well. In a fire. They said he'd been a doctor at St. James's, a hero who'd saved my life at the cost of his own. Liam Byrne. Aideen said softly. My father. Luke looked at her then, really looked at her, and Nora saw the recognition bloom. You have his eyes, the same eyes I see in old photographs they gave me. And you have hers, Aideen replied, nodding towards Nora. The same color, the same shape. Anyone could see it. I used to wonder, Luke admitted. Growing up, I'd wonder what she was like. My birth mother. Whether she'd wanted me. Whether she'd thought about me. The Cahills said she'd loved me very much. That giving me up had broken her heart, but that she'd done it to protect me from people who wanted to hurt me. I never understood what that meant. Just took it as one of those things children are told to comfort them. It was true, Nora said, her voice breaking. I did love you. So much that it hollowed me out when they told me you were dead. I lived for 43 years in a world without you in it, and it was gray and cold and empty no matter how I tried to fill it. She reached into her bag and pulled out the blue handkerchief, now carefully preserved in a clear plastic sleeve. This was yours. You wore it around your wrist as a baby. Your father, Thomas Keene, my husband, he bought it before you were born, had your initials embroidered on it. When I woke up after the fire, after the stroke, this was the first thing I saw. And I knew, somehow I knew you weren't gone, that somewhere you were still alive. Luke took the handkerchief with trembling hands, staring at the faded blue fabric and the careful stitching. I.B., he read. Luke Byrne. Luke Keene. Nora corrected gently. That was your name. Is your name. The Byrne was added later, to honor the man who saved you, but you were born Luke Keene, my son. My baby boy who I held for 30 seconds before they took you away. The silence stretched between them, heavy with emotion, too large for words. Then Luke looked up, and tears were streaming down his face. I lived my whole life thinking my mother abandoned me, he said. That's what the voice in the back of my head always whispered, even though the Cahills told me different. That I wasn't wanted. That I was a burden someone had been relieved to get rid of. He wiped his eyes roughly. And all this time you thought I was dead. We both lost each other, Nora said. But we're here now, both alive, both survivors. Luke set down the handkerchief and stood, moving to a bookshelf where he pulled down a small wooden box beautifully made with dovetail joints and a carved lid. My Cahill. He gave me this before he died. Said it was things that came with me when I arrived. Things to remember where I came from. He opened it and pulled out a small silver medal, tarnished but recognizable. St. Christopher. And this. He handed Nora a photograph, old and faded. It showed her, 31 years old, lying in a hospital bed with Luke in her arms. She was looking down at him with such love, such wonder that it hurt to see. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were the words, "She loved you enough to let you go. Never forget that." They sat together then, mother and son, separated by decades and lies but connected by blood and grief and a blue handkerchief that had survived when so much else had been lost. Luke called his wife, Catherine, and his children, a girl of 7 and a boy of 5, and introduced them to their grandmother. The children were shy at first, then curious, then delighted by this unexpected relative who cried when she hugged them and laughed when they showed her their drawings. Aideen stepped outside into the garden, giving them privacy, and stood beneath the oak tree watching the Atlantic roll gray and eternal against the shore. She thought of her father, of the impossible choice he'd made, of the life he'd sacrificed to save a child he barely knew. And she thought of her mother, Mered, who'd raised a daughter alone whilst keeping her husband's secret, never knowing if he'd succeeded or failed in his desperate gambit. "He did it," she whispered to the wind. "Da, you did it. Luke survived. He had a good life. You saved him." Behind her, through the window, she could see Nora holding her grandchildren, Luke standing beside them with his hand on his mother's shoulder, and Aideen felt the weight she'd carried since finding that cassette tape finally begin to lift. Her father hadn't been just a victim of a corrupt system. He'd been a hero in the truest sense, someone who'd sacrificed everything to do what was right, with no expectation of recognition or reward. The sun was setting when they finally prepared to leave, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible after so much gray. Luke walked them to the car carrying the blue handkerchief carefully in both hands. "Will you keep it?" Nora asked. "Your handkerchief?" Luke shook his head and pressed it back into her hands. "You keep it." "Remind yourself that I'm real, that I survived, that all the pain wasn't for nothing." He smiled, that same shy smile she'd seen in the old photograph. "But come back. Please, come back and tell me stories about my Da, about Thomas, about what he was like, about what you were like. I want to know everything." "I will," Nora promised. "Every week if you'll have me. I've missed 43 years. I don't want to miss another day." They embraced mother and son, making up for decades of lost hugs, lost moments, lost love. And when they finally pulled apart, both were crying and laughing and whole in a way neither had been before. The drive back to Dublin was quiet. Nora sat with the handkerchief pressed to her chest, feeling her heart beat against it, feeling alive in a way she hadn't since she was 31 years old and full of hope. She thought of Thomas dead these 20 years and hoped he somehow knew that their son had lived, had thrived, had become a good man with a family of his own. "Thank you," she said to Aideen. "Your father saved my son, and you saved me." "We saved each other," Aideen replied. "That's what family does." A week later, Nora returned to St. James's Hospital one final time. Not as a patient, but as a visitor. She went to the old pediatric ward, now modernized and bright, and found the space where room 12 had been. They'd renovated it, turned it into a family waiting room with comfortable chairs and toys for children. But Nora could still see the outline of the old walls, could still smell faintly the ghost of smoke. She hung the blue handkerchief on the notice board, in a frame she'd had made specially. Beneath it, a small plaque, "In memory of Dr. Liam Byrne, who chose courage over convenience, and for all those whose stories were nearly erased. May we remember what was almost forgotten." People stopped to read it as they passed, some pausing to touch the frame gently, others nodding in recognition or respect. And Nora sat in one of the comfortable chairs and wept, not from sadness but from peace. The kind of peace that comes when old wounds finally close, when secrets finally surface, when forgiveness becomes possible because the truth has been told. There are pains that time doesn't erase. It only teaches us to carry them. Nora learned this too late, but she learned that truth doesn't always come to hurt. Sometimes it comes to set you free. When she finally looked in the mirror and recognized her own face, she realized it wasn't the scar that marked her. It was the courage to have sought answers that many prefer to forget. Because living, in the end, is this: facing the reflections the past left behind, even when they hurt more than any visible wound. And you? What would you do if you discovered that everything you'd believed for an entire lifetime was a lie? Would you have the strength to forgive? Or would you let silence bury again what had been revealed? Nora chose forgiveness, not from weakness, but because she understood that sometimes the only way to close a wound is to transform it into a scar. Sometimes forgiveness isn't for those who were wrong, but for those who survived.